Welcome, everyone, to the first inaugural lecture in our series with the Wisconsin Architectural Archives. I'm Eric Vogel. I'm president of Docomomo, Wisconsin. I had at least 3 people already ask me, docomomo. Is that a food? No, it's not a momo, although, has anybody had a Tibetan momo? They're really good. You can get them here in Milwaukee. We're stand for the documentation and conservation of the modern movement. And our mission is to preserve, to document, preserve, and where we can, conserve mid-century modern buildings throughout the state of Wisconsin. We're Catholic in our, we don't hold too tightly to that 1940 to 1975 mid-century timeline. We really look at the entire 20th century. But our sweet spot is mid-century, and we're so fortunate to have Justin Miller from the Cultural Resources Management Group at WWII here tonight to talk about the post-war building boom in Milwaukee public schools. So I'll let Justin introduce himself and the topic, but I wanted to give our local rock star in architectural preservation, Matt Jarros, a chance to come up and tell you about, he's looking around, who? Me? He knows who he is. He knows he's a rock star. Yeah, there's nobody who does this better. So we're very honored to have his students here. Thanks, guys, for coming tonight, and thank you all for attending. We're going to do 2 of these a year, one in the spring and one in the fall, so look for that, and join Docomomo, Wisconsin. We would love to have you as members. We do a lot of tours, a lot of lectures. We do some advocacy, so please follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Yeah, join in. Thank you.
Great, Eric. Thank you very much. And Justin, thanks for giving me this. I said 1 minute, maybe 1.5 minutes.
I'll check.
Justin's been a great friend of the Institute and has helped us out a lot. So it's great to be here today. If you're one of my students, make sure that you sign up to the shoot otherwise. Okay? And I look around. I think I almost know everybody in the room, but I want to kind of say something for maybe some people who don't know me, because we have something happening now, kind of an 11th hour matter that I think is really interesting. And it is this, that next week, the National Ansel Adams photographer is going to be here in town, Jared Ortiz, and we have a mission to do some documentation on a couple important buildings, not the least being the Mitchell Park Domes. And we're going to be there. He's going to be here for a couple days, and we're going to be looking at doing that. But I wanted to tell you all that because we're going to have a kind of reception on Wednesday from about 5 to 7. And you'll have a chance to meet Jared if you'd like to do that, and talk to him about things that he does. He might have a short 20-minute presentation on some of the work he does, but he's going to spend a lot of time around town with me doing documentation of lots of really good and important buildings. So it'll get out there. Bobby is here somewhere, and we'll probably get it out in the social network a little bit. But literally, it's only happening within the last 10 hours or so. So I'll be quite specific by noon tomorrow about where it's going to be and when. But I just wanted to let you know that. And boy, it'd be nice if you don't know me, if you could give me your email, your contact number in the back, perhaps after the talk. So, okay, that's it. Justin, thanks for letting me say
that. Thanks, Matt. That sounds like a really, really interesting project. I know that Docomomo has had the domes at the top of their list for a long time now, so it's great to see that there's continued momentum with it. So thank you for that nice introduction. My name is Justin Miller. I am an architectural historian at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I work for a research institute. We do historic preservation consulting, and then some of my colleagues also do archaeological consulting. As Eric mentioned, I'm also part of the Docomomo Chicago chapter. So this talk tonight came out of a project that we worked on about four or so years ago. Every year, the Wisconsin Historical Society awards grants to various communities to look at specific property types. And so in 2018, the city of Milwaukee got a grant to look at all of the public schools in the city. The impetus for this project was sort of unusual. So without getting too into the weeds, there previously had been a law that restricted how the Milwaukee Public School District could sell its surplus properties. It could only sell them to other educational entities. This was a law that was enacted by the former governor, and it was meant to encourage public schools to be sold into charter school use. That law came to an end in 2018, and so the State Historic Preservation Office jumped in and commissioned this study, primarily because Wisconsin has a really, really robust historic tax credit program. Historic tax credits are a really great financial incentive for developers who are looking at reusing buildings, and schools are a really great candidate for adaptive reuse. For those of you who are architects in the crowd, you know that they just work really well to adapt, particularly as residential uses, because of the bay sizes, because of the room sizes, because of the corridor spines that are really great for running mechanicals, things like that. And so the State Historic Preservation Office initiated this project. We spent about a year going around. We ended up looking at about 250 schools. We were looking at every building that had been purpose-built as a public school since the beginning of Milwaukee. Here's some of the results of what we found. We ended up finding that there were about 46 that were no longer extant. They had been demolished. 224 total buildings. Maybe about 30 or so of those had been converted into other uses, residential community centers, things like that. Quite a few were also vacant. 13 of them were already listed in the National Register. 5 of those had been tax credit projects. As part of our study, we also looked at eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places and for significance for local historic designation. And we found that there were 28 schools that were eligible for National Register listing or for local designation. And then we also identified 15 schools that needed more research. We didn't quite get to the point where we could say these are definitely eligible for the National Register, but we laid the groundwork so that future researchers could follow up on those and hopefully get some of those buildings listed on the National Register as well. So our survey process was sort of a fun adventure. Going into the process, we didn't realize that public schools, can have multiple names. I think most of us probably know this over the year. We sort of know this, but we didn't think about that when we were planning how we were going to do this field work. So we started going in. I have these lists of schools, and I have a 4th district school and a 6th Street school, and they both have the same address. And I'm thinking, so what's going on? Did they demolish one? Did they build a new one? And then I'm like, no. Actually, what happened is that the school board renamed all of the schools at least 4 times. So one of the big challenges is that, so this one on the cover, for example, was built as the 6th district school when it was built. Shortly afterwards, it was renamed Albert Kegel School, very briefly. And then there was a district-wide move to rename the schools after the streets. So it was renamed whatever street it's on, I'm not recalling. But shortly after that, they realized that because of most of the north-south arterials, there were 3 27th Street schools. And that got confusing. And so the district went back to other naming conventions. So this became Kegel School again. So this was one of the initial challenges of the survey project, was just figuring out the names. The other challenge of the project was that by the time we had sorted out all the names and all the addresses, it was January 5th, 2019. And we had about 4 weeks of snow. So I apologize for some of the photos in this presentation. They are very snowy, very gray, sort of washed out. We tried to rephotograph some as much as we could, but I apologize for any photos that are less than stellar in this presentation. So, what did we find? Here's sort of like a scatter chart of where schools are. We sort of divided the schools into these three areas, sort of like the pre-1915 ones that included a lot of 19th century schools. And then this period from 1915 to 1940 was sort of like a golden age in Milwaukee's public school eras. And then the post-war schools, 1949 to 1979. The breakdown is here. One thing that we also noticed that you'll probably notice as well is that these eras conform very closely to the growth of the city at the time. So the oldest schools are in the historic core of Milwaukee, and then as the city sort of spread, the relative age of the schools spread as well. Of course, the big thing that happened that we are going to talk about tonight was the baby boom. So I like this photo on the right. I had to include it. This is a family photo. It's of a hospital in Manitowoc. And reportedly, my uncle is in one of these bassinets. I also, because we're here for architecture, so this hospital addition was built in 1947 because the hospital knew that they were going to need a new neonatal unit. So like there's this great terrazzo floor, and there's these sort of like minimal ceiling beams and this great light fixture. But then of course it's a Catholic hospital, so there's Jesus stuff on the walls, and the nun is wearing a face mask. Anyway, so 1946, soldiers come back from the war, everybody starts having families. The school district typically looks at health statistics, particularly birth statistics, to look at what they are going to need in terms of their planning needs. And so what they are seeing is that in 1946, 6 years later, all of those babies are going to be going to kindergarten. And so there is a spike in kindergarten enrollment in 1951. I have some figures here. The enrollment, the kindergarten enrollment was pretty much about 9,000 for the previous decade or so. And then it went to 17,000 within just a few years. So at the same time, school district officials knew that they were going to have to come up with places to put all these new students. So the city was annexing as well. The city area doubled in size pretty much in a decade. And so we have the city growing outwards, and we have all these new students that are going to have to put somewhere. So beginning in 1950, the Milwaukee School Board undertook the most ambitious building campaign in its history. Over the course of 15 years, they would build 58 brand new schools. They also completed over 60 additions and expansions. They also undertook a significant number of modernization projects to older schools, which were typically in the inner city neighborhoods. One question is how did they do it? How do you build 58 buildings in 15 years? So previously, the school board had an internal architecture department. They handled all construction, all renovations, things like that. The acting architect who was in charge of that bureau was a man named Guy Edson Wiley. Guy Wiley is a great architect name, by the way. He was in that position for 22 years. He designed something like 27 schools. And so he set an entire generation of what schools looked like in Milwaukee. When the school board initiated this building campaign, they eliminated their internal department, and instead they started contracting out to outside architecture firms, which had two main effects. The first was that it was possible to build a lot more projects very quickly because you had multiple firms doing design and construction administration aspects of it. The other effect was that you get a lot more variety in terms of what these buildings looked like, because you had multiple firms working on the design of the schools instead of just one centralized design firm. So before we dig into what these post-war schools look like, I just wanted to include a little bit of context on what was there at the time. What did the pre-war schools look like? Historically, Milwaukee placed a really high value on public education. This is one of the legacies of the socialist city government. This meant that the city had a lot of really well-built and really well-designed public schools. There had been a series of building campaigns in the late 19th century, which produced schools like 4th Street School from 1890. That's in the top right. 4th Street is one of those schools that also got renamed multiple times, and now it's WWII or Upper Campus. There were also a large number of Art Deco and Collegiate Gothic schools from the teens and 20s and 30s. And then the problem is that there simply wasn't enough space for all the children that were coming in at the baby boom. So to set the stage for looking at the post-war schools, 19th century schools were very utilitarian. In Milwaukee, they tended to be very sort of like tall rectangular blocks. The cruciform plan was a pretty typical starting point. There's a wide central corridor. There are large classrooms on either side. And then there's these smaller specialized rooms. So in the plan, for example, it's a library and some sort of science lab in the blue. Milwaukee public schools from the 19th century, or pre-war, I should say, also almost always had a third floor assembly room that was typically used as a gymnasium. A lot of schools also had kindergartens. The kindergarten rooms were introduced in 1881. So what happened after the war? Well, the first thing is that these really tall volumes spread out, either just 2 stories or to 1 story, and they rambled, or blocks and blocks and blocks. Part of the reason for that is because as the Milwaukee School Board was looking at sites for new schools, they would typically purchase land in areas that they annexed before the area was developed. So they could set aside very large tracts of land and hold them in reserve until the school was needed. And then they could build these enormous, sprawling elementary schools that went on for 2 or 3 blocks. Another thing that happened on the bottom is the obviously change in materials. We all know that this kind of ornamentation, masonry, terracotta, became prohibitively expensive after the war. And so architects in the post-war schools started looking at new building materials that had been developed during the war, some sorts of like ideas about prefabrication, about reusing certain details. Although I do want to point out here, because later on I'll be talking about some repeated details that the school used on multiple buildings, I think the idea actually existed earlier. So this school right here it's the Grand Avenue School on Grand and 16th or so. This was designed by the architectural firm of Van Ryn and de Gallica. And they designed a large number of schools in the 20s and 30s, and almost all of them look something like this. They had a formula. And so, for example, these little terracotta buttresses show up all over this school. And it was basically that one decorative detail that they specified for that building, and it showed up everywhere. And it was a way of doing the sort of cost-saving, repetitive module. So that idea of having modular parts or repeated parts started earlier than the post-war years. Okay, so here is a plan. This is one that's on display before. Some of you got a chance to flip through them, I think. I just wanted to talk through this plan to help us all understand how these post-war schools are laid out. So it's a very, very straightforward, very functional plan. We have the corridors, sort of a T-shaped corridor that separates the classrooms, smaller classrooms on either side of the corridor. There is a large triple purpose room here. This is not just a double purpose, this is a triple purpose, which means that it's a cafeteria and a gym, and there's a stage right there. So it's a triple purpose room. Then there are larger rooms here that I think were specialized for things like art or music or perhaps some science rooms. What that translates to in elevation is that sort of long, sprawling building that I was talking about before. You can see here's the main entrance. This tall volume is that triple purpose room. And then here's the classroom ring on this end. Oops. And if we go back, you can sort of see here, very faintly, that the architects even plan for future expansion. That if this school and its neighborhood continue to grow, this school could just be extended indefinitely by making the corridor and just adding on more and more classrooms as needed. So now we get into the fun part, which is looking at pictures. John Burroughs Junior High. This is one of my favorite post-war schools, so I thought it'd be fun to start with because there's a lot going on here. So Donald Grebe, does everyone know the name Donald Grebe?
Yeah.
Okay. The designer of the domes. Just, I need to put a plug in for that. Grebe was very much a classicist by training. So he had studied at the University of Pennsylvania under a very Beaux-Arts curriculum. He spent some time at the American Academy in Rome, and then he came back to Milwaukee and started designing buildings like this. And so what we see here is that architects like Grebe are trying to make a building that is very functional, but give it some detail without making it prohibitively expensive. So how do you do that? You do, oops. You do things like masonry. There's decorative masonry here. There's decorative masonry here. Using some sort of entry condition was also a favorite technique that architects could use. There's this great sort of concrete scalloped entryway here, and it's this reinforced concrete canopy. There's also this really great mansard roof. It's copper, and it just has a flat roof behind it. It sort of hides some mechanicals, but it's a really, really great addition to it. And then this long, low mass is contrasted with this two-story section that again has masonry details on the bottom, and then these really great vertical slits that sort of give this sense of rhythm to the larger mass. Right next door is another Grebe school. This was built as Washington Irving. Now it's the Sign Language School. Has the same idea of the folded plate entry canopy. This one also has this really great window wall. Originally, these were all clear glass. They were replaced with this sort of opaque panel fairly recently. But then also, you can't, it's sort of hard to see, but there's this great vertical stained glass window in the stairwell. And it has these little pops of primary colors, almost like a Mondrian painting. It's a really, really fun detail, I think, for an elementary school. Here is a junior-senior high school. This is John Marshall. I should have mentioned earlier, we've only been looking at junior high schools so far because there were fewer of them, so they tend to have more architectural details. We're going to be looking at elementary school in just a little bit. There's more of them, and they are not as highly refined or sort of highly developed as some of the junior high schools or high schools. So John Marshall Junior Senior High, combination holding 6 grades of students. It's an enormous building. This is almost getting to the point where it's like a college campus, like a community college campus, because it's so large. So this one, you can see in the plan here, there's classroom wings. This tall part here is an auditorium. There's actually 2 gymnasiums at the back. There's multiple courtyards. And it was so large that the architectural firms of Brust and Brust and Eschweiler teamed up to design it. Let's see what else I've done. Oh, so it also had science labs, industrial education shops, home economics labs. And these were all things that were part of the junior high school curriculum. Here is one of the new high schools. This is West Division High School, designed by Maynard Meyer. Here again, this is one of the schools that almost takes on the size of a community college campus. There's this great variety of expression of different building spaces. At the right here, this is an auditorium with a fly tower. There's also a 3-story classroom block at the back here. And then there is gymnasium is visible to the right over here. This is now the High School for the Arts. Audubon Junior High School, designed by Grassfield and Johnson in 1959. In our research, we were pretty confident that this was the first public school in Milwaukee that used a window wall assembly. So it was much more common for the public schools to have mostly brick cladding with punched openings earlier. And then the architects started to move into things like this, where there were just brick end walls. And you ended up with a sort of, not quite a curtain wall, but it's sort of like a window wall assembly. I just wanted to throw in 2 additions as well. Because high schools were the largest and the most expensive to build, the school board preferred to add on to existing high schools whenever possible. So there's some really great post-war additions. This one is at Washington High School on Layton Boulevard. You can see the original 1920s collegiate Gothic building on the right here. I think this addition is a really fantastic addition. It looks a little bit forbidding in this photo, but it's a really, really lovely color of brick, and the proportions and the massing and the rhythm really match the original 1920s Gothic building. This one is another one, probably less well known. This is at Juneau High School, which is a 1920s strip classicist school. What we're looking at here is a 1975 edition by Darby Bogner. This is there's a swimming pool inside of this. So it's blank walls. But instead of just having the blank walls, Darby Bogner continues the fenestration rhythm and patterns of the historic building. You can just barely see it over here. But it's a really, really sensitive addition because it continues the same compositional lines. It uses the same limestone as the original. It's really, really, it's a sort of a seamless extension of the historicist building without being an overt copy of it. Okay, so as I said before, there's a lot of elementary schools. One of the interesting things that we found was that one of the ways the school board could put up so many elementary schools was by reusing plans. So we actually identified three sort of broad typologies, which I'm going to talk about now. Here's a typology that was developed in 1959 and was used on 8 schools. During the project, we nicknamed it the American Author typology for obvious reasons when you see the names of the schools. These schools all had an identical plan consisting of the long classroom wing on this side, a tall multi-story space on this side, and then some sort of entry sequence or hyphen linking the two of them. There were ways to distinguish the individual schools built in this plan. It's sort of analogous to tract housing, where you use a standard plan, but then you mix up the details or the materials for variety. So, for example, Louisa May Alcott up here has a canopy at the entryway. Let's see, this is Cooper. It's sort of hard to see here, but this wall is textured. It has this sort of patterned protruding brick that gives some texture to the brick. Here, which is Hawthorne, another plan we have on display, concrete is left exposed with the brick infill. And here at Whitman, this one is sort of Miesian. It has these black I-beams that are left exposed, the black beams across the top, and then this tan brick. Very much the kind of thing that Mies was doing on the IIT campus around this time. So another one of the details that we identified was this, what we call the glass block and sunshade typology. This was introduced here at the 81st Street School, designed by Grassold and Johnson in 1950. 81st Street was the first purpose-built post-war Milwaukee public school. And I think it really established a new architectural vocabulary, such as the flat-roofed building masses and the juxtaposition of vertical and horizontal compositional elements. Here's a closer look at that window type. It has a lower band of operable sashes, an upper band of translucent glass block, and a horizontal aluminum sunshade separating the two. In the post-war schools, there was this really, really intense interest in dealing with things like light and heating, comfort, and things like that. I'm going to ask you to look away from the screen for just a minute, and we're going to think about 19th century schools. So in the 19th century, before there was reliable electric lighting, schoolrooms tended to be very tall with large windows. They would have been set up just like this room that we're in. Windows were typically along the left side of the room as you were facing the blackboard, because in the 19th century, you would be right-handed, whether you liked it or not. And if the windows were along the left side, they wouldn't shade your paper as you were writing. And so 19th century classrooms, and even up until World War II, the ideal classroom was laid out that way, so that the natural light came over the student's left shoulder. So after the war, we now have electric light, and it gets to the point where there is too much light in a classroom. And so architects start looking at ways of mitigating glare and too much direct light. This is about the same time that they're starting to think about minimizing views to the outside. And that really didn't show up until the 1970s, but it's starting to percolate around. And so this typology of the clear windows down here for a view, and then the sort of soft diffused light up here without having a glare. That's where this typology comes from. Another typology that we identified, we call it the sunshade and monitor. Here is Clement Avenue. I wanted to start with this one because it has its original windows still opened. So what we're looking at here is there's this a curved roof, and then there are these monitor windows set sort of like dormers onto that roof. This is one of my really bad January photos. So we're going to go to another picture that I retook. Unfortunately, 55th Street, the windows have been covered over. But you can see this is a sunshade. And so at certain times of day, you get these great shadows falling on these masonry elements. The masonry elements cant outwards. I've been calling them fins all along. The building plans and the president of Docomomo Chicago called them piers, so I've been corrected. But this is one of the drawings that we have on display as well. And this is really a cool building typology. So what's going on here? I apologize, it's a little bit hard to see, but we can look afterwards at the actual drawings themselves. So here's a sectional drawing. So we've cut the building in half lengthwise, and we're looking through it. In the middle here is the corridor. There are classrooms on either side. And then there is this glue laminated beam roof that sort of stretches across the entire thing. And then there are these monitor dormers set into the glue lam roof. Here on the outside is that sunshade. And then this is the masonry pier or fin that we were looking at before. What this is doing is provides light in through these windows, but the sunshades help shade the quality of the light a little bit. And then these monitors up here help bounce in additional light into the room. And this is actually something that was studied very extensively in the architectural press related to school design. And so there were all sorts of ideas about how you could design classrooms to get either bilateral lighting with two lighting sources, sort of with the shed roof, or even with trilateral lighting through the means of like a sawtooth dormer or a skylight or something. This detail most likely was developed by Harry Bogner, an architect that I wasn't as familiar with until I started this project. Do we know Harry Bogner in this room? A couple? Okay, a couple people. His brother, Walter Bogner, is probably better known because Walter taught at MIT with people like Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer. The two brothers were both trained in Vienna as architects, and they ended up back in Milwaukee, practiced together briefly, and then Walter went off to Boston, and Harry stayed here. So Jeremiah Curtin School, finished in 1954, is a two-story version of this sunshade and monitor typology. So you can see these piers here, the sunshades are there, and then you can sort of see the curve of the glue laminated roof with those monitors sticking up. Unfortunately, within a few years, the school board started looking at the cost of these schools, and they felt that the bells and whistles on the sunshade schools were too expensive for the results. And so in their 1956 annual report, they acknowledged that schools, like the Curtin School, were widely publicized in the architectural press, but they were too expensive to be justified. And here's a quote from their 1956 annual report saying, "Milwaukee is not building such schools now." So we are going to switch gears now. So I consider this a trigger warning. We are going to switch from talking about architecture to talking about the social impacts and cultural impacts that some of these buildings had. So I think one of the really great things about Docomomo and holding an event at a place like this at the Wisconsin Architectural Archives is that it gives us a chance to look at the bigger context of issues and stories, not just at the buildings. And so we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this. So I mentioned at the beginning, Milwaukee built 58 new schools as part of its post-war building campaign. Most of these new schools were in the outer neighborhoods, as seen in the center map. There is a direct reason for that. In the 1950s and 1960s, Milwaukee had an aggressive annexation policy in order to deal with a housing shortage and to shore up the city's tax base. The city just over doubled its land area between 1950 and 1965. The school board had had a policy in place since the 19-teens that there should be a school within a half mile of every student. This was known as the neighborhood schools policy. Because of this policy, the school board prioritized building new schools in the newly annexed areas instead of in the inner city. At the same time, most African American families were prevented from moving out of the inner city because of racist restrictive covenants and discriminatory redlining, which made it difficult to get Fed back mortgages. An example of the redline map is seen at the right. Segregated neighborhoods created segregated and overcrowded schools because students were required to attend the schools closest to their home. In the early 1960s, a group of community leaders, faith leaders, and civil rights activists organized to protest against school segregation. The group sponsored marches, school boycotts, and organized freedom schools for students who were boycotting the public schools. In 1964, construction began on the new McDowell School, which was intended to reduce overcrowding at 4 nearby elementary schools. The group of integration activists publicly objected to the new school because it would become another segregated school due to the segregated housing policies. They began holding daily demonstrations at the McDowell construction site, holding vigils, and sometimes chaining themselves to gates or construction equipment. Despite the protests, construction continued, and the school eventually opened in 1967. Another school that was involved in community protest and that was played later into the desegregation lawsuit was Fulton Junior High School, designed by von Grossman and Van Lenen in 1959. Fulton was one of the feeder schools from the inner core elementary schools, and it very quickly became overcrowded as well. The school desegregation movement came to a head in 1965 when Milwaukee attorney and state assemblyman Lloyd Barbie filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of 41 Black and white students from a number of schools across the city. The lawsuit charged the school board with intentionally maintaining racial segregation in its schools. The school board never denied that the public schools were segregated, but they insisted that it was caused by the city's racially segregated housing rather than by school board policies. While it is true that Milwaukee's neighborhoods were racially segregated, the lawsuit argued that the use of the neighborhood school policy, that's the half-mile school from every student, the lawsuit argued that the use of this policy resulted in a corresponding segregation of the schools. So, after an 11-year court trial, a federal judge ruled that segregation exists in the Milwaukee public schools, and this segregation was intentionally created and maintained by the school board. This decision was based on 3 primary factors. First, the fact that the school board built additions onto overcrowded schools rather than change district boundaries to allow Black students into predominantly white schools. Second, the fact that the school board overwhelmingly allowed white students to transfer out of predominantly Black schools, but it made it much more difficult for Black students to transfer anywhere. And third, because of the practice of intact busing. This is where Black students from an overcrowded school would go to their overcrowded school in the morning, be put on a bus with their teacher, sent to a white school with empty classrooms, stay there for the morning, be put back on the bus to go to their overcrowded school for lunch, go back to the white school in the afternoon for classes, and then come back on the bus to their overcrowded school at the end of the day. After the federal ruling, the school board appealed the ruling several times, but eventually began developing a system of involuntary integration that relied heavily on magnet schools and specialty schools. Change did not happen overnight, though, and it is still an ongoing struggle. Milwaukee still has one of the most segregated public school systems in the country. I wanted to close with this photo, though, of Joyce Kilmer School, taken the year it opened in 1960. I think two things are sort of interesting about this photo. Not only is Kilmer a really cool school, it has these great sort of post and beam exposed rafter tails, but several white students from Kilmer ended up joining the Milwaukee desegregation lawsuit. And that's something that I wanted to reiterate, that quite a few of the schools were racially integrated. It wasn't an across-the-boards issue. I don't know if any of the white students from Kilmer are in this photo, but I do think this photo is a great reminder of the people who joined together to fight for equality during the desegregation movement. So, my parting thought is that the next time you are admiring a mid-century school in your own community, I'd like you to challenge to think about whether that school has deeper significance that goes beyond just its modernist architecture. So we do have some time for some questions. This QR code is to this report that I was referencing. And so if you want to snap a picture of it or email me about anything, feel free to. So we will take some questions, and then we can sort of move this conversation to the tables and look at all the really cool drawings that are on display. So anybody have any thoughts? Burning issues? Yeah.
So schools like that, why were they always elevated? You know what I mean? They were always
Mm-hmm. Yep. The question is, so schools like this, like the 19th century Kegel school that we're seeing here, why were they elevated? The short answer is because when they were built, the boiler and the furnace typically went in the basement. And then later on, after improvements in building technology, like in the 19-teens and 1920s, when the boiler and the furnace typically went in another building out back, that made a really good space for things like gymnasiums. So the basement space typically wasn't used as classroom space because the windows weren't large enough to get enough light in, but it was an economical way of getting more floor space without making a bigger building. They may have been. They may have been. They were, I know, doing our research, they were a lot more worried about fire. Fire was a constant concern, and that's why the schools were almost always built of fireproof masonry, typically brick. And that's also why in our post-war schools, I didn't mention, but another benefit of having the one-story sprawling building was that it was easier to evacuate instead of having stairs for young children to go up and down. Any questions?
So part of the joy of preservation is thinking about how are we going to reuse these buildings. And since they are going to keep being schools, because we will need that forever, as you mentioned before, they can only be sold for this purpose or repurposed for this task. How do you think these schools are prepared for the new waves of education? So all of these, when you are showing the plan view, mostly is like a Lancasterian way of teaching. So it's very old school, like we are now. The professor in front and everyone else is, yes, professor, yes. but nowadays there are more like different ways of teaching. How do you think would be the wisest approach for these schools if they want to change in the future?
That's a really great question. So in case people in the back didn't hear the question, I'm going to paraphrase you, Felipe, but sort of sum up. The idea about how schools like this can be adapted for changing approaches to how we teach. And I think, I'm not a educational, I don't even know what they're called. I'm an architectural historian. One of the things that we noticed is that in the 1970s and 1980s, I didn't include any in this presentation because we were looking mostly at the immediate post-war period, but the Milwaukee public schools did experiment with the ideas of things like having pod rooms, where it was like very large open plan sorts of areas, and there were areas for students to huddle and have a sort of more interactive experience. And they worked for a while. There were challenges because of acoustics and because of, especially in elementary schools, kids are unruly creatures. And if you put a group of kids together, they're going to interact. And the problem is, if you get kids interacting, they're not learning. Not learning in the way that maybe the teacher wants them to. And so by the mid-1980s, MPS started moving away from that idea of sort of the open plan pod sort of classroom. I think that it is something that they're still learning how to adapt. How to use spaces to respond to current or changing teaching styles. I do think that based on sort of anecdotally what we heard from teachers during this project is that the buildings that are faring the best are the ones that are the most flexible in terms of usage. So like very simple, large spaces, and then places to put technology and all of the sort of wires and things that they need without having really specific programmed uses. But it is a challenge. And I will challenge all of you students who are all sitting on that side for whatever reason, to think about this. I mean, maybe that could be a great studio project for Matt's studio next year, is to figure out how to adaptively reuse a school into a school. Other questions? Yep.
Just going off the adaptive reuse thing, I mean, it seems like a lot of those residential adaptive reuses I assume are the older schools with the, nice tall ceilings and stuff. Have any of those projects either locally or in Wisconsin than the more modern, kind of less grand buildings?
So the question is about adaptive reuse. They've all been 19th century schools. Have there been any of these post-war modern schools adaptively reused anything else? The short answer is no, because they still work as they were intended to be built. They're also 70, 75, 80 years old yet, so they haven't worn out completely. And the upkeep tends to be a lot easier rather than on 19th century buildings, they have all sorts of wonky finishes and no right angles and plaster and stuff that has to be taken care of. Actually, yeah.
So going back to it was the sun shading and monitor window, or dormer plan. Did you look into why a lot of those schools ended up closing those monitor windows? Because the building's designed for that purpose, and it feels weird to close it off.
We didn't look into it specifically, but my instinct would be because of heat loss for thermal issues through the window. Because it was I would suspect that the school just covered them with insulated panels on the outside instead of replacing the window with a more energy efficient glass. Okay, Dave.
How did the awarding of schools during this period, or really any period, how did that happen? There are architects that seemed to be very popular, very evident in public school design? And did local school boards get involved in describing what they wanted? Did they have veto power over design or some sort of recommendation? How did that process work?
So the question is about the relationship between how individual firms were awarded contracts and how much oversight there was by the school board. And the answer to that is, I do not know. That is one of the things that we didn't have time to dig into with this report, the sort of dynamics between the school board. So as I mentioned, the school board they dissolved their internal architectural department, but they still had a few people on staff who were sort of in charge. They were steering the boat. So people like Tom Eschweiler was the head of the MPS architecture division for a while. And I think they had some sort of oversight as to what was happening, but I don't know the details of that. Yes.
So, as you think back across almost a century of school design, we're looking from the late 19th century to almost the 1970s, 1980s. I'm struck by that one slide where the school board determined that Harry Bogner's, light monitor designs were too good, too expensive. We can't build any more of those. It's not responsible financially. So, do you either have evidence or can you speculate, now that you've seen and surveyed so many schools over so many decades, do you see a diminishment in design? I mean, oftentimes we'll compare, God, that beautiful Rufus King, high school from 1920, and why didn't
May I have your attention, please? The Central Library will be closing in 30 minutes. In 15 minutes, all public computers will shut down.
So, we'll often look at architects in the 70s and 80s and say, why didn't they design more beautiful schools? To what degree was that budget driven?
The question is, why did things used to be nicer in the past? And I think that you've answered your own question. That yes, again, this isn't that we didn't really dig into a lot, but we looked very briefly at the budgetary allocations, and it does seem like as construction costs went up, the allocation for construction stayed even. So it had the result of the buildings had to be cheaper. And it wasn't a issue of like somebody on the school board decided no more terracotta. We hate terracotta. It was they were grappling with a lot of realities. So if anybody ever has a lot of time, the complete minutes of the Milwaukee School Board are housed in the basement of the Zeidler building in City Records. They are fascinating.
Yeah, that would be great extra credit for your class.
So, I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
You mentioned that a number of schools were eligible for entry into the National Register of Historic Preservation. What is the impact of that? What would be the consequence of them becoming part of the National Register? And then kind of secondarily, what happens to the building? Are they repurposed? Do they remain an active school, or do they become something else then? That's
a really great question, and thank you. I should have done that promo on my own, so thank you for the prompt. Question is, what happens when a building gets listed on the National Register? Benefits, drawbacks, things like that. So the short answer is for a lot of these buildings, if they are being repurposed as something else, being listed on the National Register provides access to those historic tax credits. And so that's a prerequisite to get the historic tax credits. So if a school closes and the school board sells it to a developer and the developer wants to turn it into an assisted living facility, the first thing they're going to do is get it listed so that they can reclaim 25% of their construction costs because of that historic tax credit. being listed on the National Register doesn't place any restrictions on the owners of the building. It's largely honorific. It does, if somebody wants to do any sort of construction to it, they should think about how that their project would affect the building. And it's because if they change too much of it, it's not eligible for being on the register anymore. So it usually encourages people to be good stewards of their buildings. I don't know of any schools that are still functioning as schools that are listed in the National Register. And the reason for that is one of the other things that happens when a building is listed on the National Register and it's owned by a public entity, it triggers certain types of review processes they have to go through if they're going to do anything to it. Those don't apply to private owners, but it adds a little bit of extra work to something like the school board, and so they're usually not willing to subject themselves to additional review voluntarily. Okay, well, thank you all very much.
And thank you, Justin. Thank you for a profound, meaningful analysis of our public schools. I mean, I think that's opened our eyes.
They were fun photos. Let's not get carried away.
No, really. The second half was really, thank you for that. And I want to thank our partners tonight, the Milwaukee Public Library. We have a number of people from the staff here this evening that made this possible, stayed late to allow this lecture series to happen. But especially the number of archives that are just behind the wall here is astounding. Fantastic Marine Archive, of course, our beloved Wisconsin Architectural Archive. Groups like Docomomo, researchers like Justin, we can't do what we want to do without archivists, without collections, without libraries and museums who keep these contents safe in perpetuity for us. So not just the students in the room, I encourage everyone to tell their friends, especially their architect friends, that the archives are here for them to use when they close their offices, for them to use during their design processes to research older buildings. These are facilities that are open to the public. So tonight we have drawings from the archives that you're able to page through. This is available to you at any time. And I would encourage you also to seek out archives in Madison. The Wisconsin Historical Society has fantastic collections of modern architecture. The Keck and Keck archives are there, John Randall McDonald, a lot of the mid-century names that you might know and love. So those partners, as well as Historic Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance, many of you might have gotten emails from them. These are fantastic organizations working very hard to preserve the architecture that builds our community and gives us a sense of identity. The reason that we cherish Milwaukee, you know, when we talk to people about the domes and tell them that there's still an option for the domes to be torn down, that is part of public policy at the county level today, they're shocked. They immediately say, tear down the domes? And I say, yeah, that's on the table. They immediately reach for a pen to sign the petition. So just be aware of what's going on in the community. We're here to work together with our partners to educate and to document and conserve, and we're very, very happy that you came tonight. And please follow us on Instagram and Facebook and help support Docomomo, Wisconsin.
What is your account name?
Excuse me?
What is your account name?
It's all on the sheet as you leave, so please see the exhibition again, all right? Take care. Thank you.